The cold, metallic walls of the Galactic Council security station hummed with energy, their faint glow casting eerie reflections along the chamber's sleek surface. High Commander Varlix stood with his hands clasped behind his back, his elongated features set in a mask of practiced authority. Before him, surrounded by armed sentries, knelt the prisoner, a human soldier clad in torn combat fatigues, his wrists bound in reinforced restraints. Sergeant Jack Reynolds didn't so much as flinch. His gaze remained level, blue eyes sharp despite the bruises along his jawline. He had been stripped of his weapons, his gear confiscated, yet nothing about him suggested vulnerability. He sat still, unnervingly composed, as if waiting for something the others couldn't see. Varlix studied him with veiled curiosity, tilting his head. "You are accused of multiple violations against the Galactic Council's neutrality acts. Your kind is reckless, undisciplined, yet you infiltrate war zones with disturbing efficiency. Tell me, human, are you simply lucky, or is there more to you than your crude appearance suggests?" Reynolds remained silent. He had seen men like Varlix before, figures who believed that power came from rank, that authority alone could bend a man's will. He had learned long ago that silence unnerved him more than defiance. Lieutenant Kor shifted beside his commander, his reptilian eyes narrowing. Unlike the others, he was studying Reynolds with the caution of a man who recognized danger even when it was caged. He had seen prisoners beg, threaten, break under pressure. This one did none of those things. Varlix exhaled impatiently. "You will speak. You will tell us what we wish to know. The more cooperative you are, the less unpleasant this process needs to be." Still, Reynolds gave no reaction. The guards flanking him adjusted their grips on their weapons, uneasy despite their overwhelming numbers. Varlix turned away, his expression unreadable. "Take him to the interrogation chamber. Use whatever means necessary." The guards yanked Reynolds to his feet and marched him down a series of corridors, their boots clicking against the polished floors. The station's architecture was pristine, symmetrical, cold in a way that suggested a civilization that had long since abandoned the need for warmth. The air was sterile, artificial, lacking the subtle, grounding sense of earth and sweat that marked human spaces. They reached the chamber, a stark, windowless room lined with neural interface equipment. A single chair sat in the center, its restraints gleaming under the dim lighting. The guards forced Reynolds into it, securing his limbs before stepping back. Varlix entered with Kor and another figure, a thin, willowy alien with translucent skin and two large eyes. Dr. Zeltor, a specialist in extraction techniques. His kind excelled in peeling back the layers of the mind, sifting through memories with clinical detachment. Zeltor approached, his gaze flickering over Reynolds with detached interest. "Humans have proven resistant to traditional methods," he mused, voice barely above a whisper. "Physical pain is inefficient. Their threshold is unpredictable. But the mind," his fingers ghosted over a control panel, activating a series of neural probes. "The mind is far more pliable." Kor watched as the machine powered up, its soft hum filling the air. He had seen these sessions before. He had never seen a human endure one. Reynolds, however, remained unnervingly still. Even as the first tendrils of invasive energy probed at his consciousness, he gave nothing. No flinch, no tightening of the jaw. His breathing remained steady. Zeltor frowned, adjusted the settings, increased the intensity. Still nothing. Varlix's irritation deepened. "You test my patience, human." Finally, Reynolds spoke. His voice was quiet, but there was an edge to it, a coiled tension beneath the calm. "You're making a mistake." Varlix scoffed. "A mistake?" Reynolds tilted his head slightly, as if considering something. "You don't know what I am. You think you do, but you don't." Kor felt a sliver of unease. He had assumed this human was simply well-trained. Now he wasn't so sure. Zeltor pressed deeper, his probe searching for a foothold in the soldier's mind. Images flickered across the display, fragmented, disjointed. Battlefields, Long stretches of patience in dust and shadow. The slow, measured exhale before a trigger pull. Then, something changed. The machine stuttered, flickering with static. Zeltor's hands twitched, confusion flashing across his features. That's impossible. Reynolds looked at him then. Stop. Zeltor's breath hitched. His fingers jerked away from the controls. Sweat beaded along his translucent skin. Cord took a step forward. What's wrong? Zeltor's hands trembled. His voice, so steady before, faltered. His mind, it's trained, structured in ways I've never seen. There are walls within walls. Layers of, he swallowed. I tried to push deeper, and I lost myself for a moment. Varlix's expression darkened. You're telling me one human resisted you? Zeltor didn't answer. He only stepped back, his unease palpable. Reynolds exhaled slowly. The room felt different now. The power dynamic had shifted in a way that was difficult to define, yet undeniable. He was still restrained, still outnumbered. But suddenly, none of that seemed to matter. Varlix straightened, schooling his features. Enough of this. If the mind fails, the body will not. Take him to the penal colony. Let time do what science could not. The guards moved forward, unlocking the restraints. Reynolds rose without resistance. But as they led him away, Core remained still, watching him go. For the first time since the capture, he felt a quiet, creeping certainty settle into his bones. They had made a mistake. The interrogation chamber was colder than before, though it had nothing to do with temperature. The air felt thinner, taut with an invisible pressure none of the aliens could name, but all could sense. High Commander Varlix stood at the edge of the room, arms folded, his frustration barely masked beneath a veneer of detached authority. Sergeant Jack Reynolds sat motionless in the chair, his restraints digging into his wrists. The dull glow of the neural probe overhead pulsed rhythmically, searching for purchase in his mind. But it was met with nothing but resistance. Dr. Zeltor hovered over the control panel, fingers hesitating above the interface. The last session had unsettled him in ways he could not articulate. He was not an easily rattled creature. His species prided itself on its ability to unspool the minds of lesser beings, reducing thoughts to malleable strings. And yet, when he had probed into the human's consciousness, it had felt like stepping into an abyss rather than a mind. No order, no chaos, only control, endless and absolute. Lieutenant Core leaned against the far wall, arms crossed, observing. He had served in enough campaigns to recognize the difference between bravado and genuine confidence. The latter was rare. This human had it. Varlix stepped forward, his voice clipped. Doctor, proceed. Zeltor inhaled sharply and adjusted the frequency of the probes. The machine whirred, its tendrils reaching deeper. The human's pulse remained steady. The readouts flickered, struggling to process what they were encountering. Then a shift. Flashes of memory crackled to life on the display. Deserts bathed in the dying glow of a setting sun. The silent patience of a man lying still for hours, watching, waiting. Calculated breaths. The whisper of wind against fabric. A single pull of the trigger. A body crumpling a mile away. Core tensed. This was not the memory of a soldier who fought in formations, who charged into battle wielding brute force. This was something else. Something precise. Varlix scoffed. A sniper. Zeltor's fingers trembled as he attempted to push further, peeling back layers, seeking a weak point. The moment he found an opening, the human's mind retaliated. The doctor gasped and stumbled back, his large eyes going wide, his hands shaking violently. He saw me. Varlix turned sharply. What? Zeltor clutched his temples, breath ragged. He knew I was there. He was waiting. He swallowed hard. He let me in. Then he turned the scope on me. Silence. Reynolds lifted his gaze, his voice even. How's that headache? Zeltor shuddered and turned away, his pride unable to mask his fear. Varlix's jaw tightened. Enough of this. Physical interrogation it is. Two guards stepped forward, one raising a stun baton, the other unlocking the restraints just enough to allow movement, controlled, predictable. They had done this before. This was procedure. The first strike came fast. Reynolds shifted just enough to lessen the blow, his muscles absorbing the impact rather than resisting it. A dull ache, manageable. The second guard swung for his ribs. He twisted, letting the strike glance off rather than land clean. Varlix watched with disinterest. This doesn't need to be difficult, human. Reynolds exhaled slowly. The guards were overconfident, sloppy. They had never fought someone like him. The third strike came, a diagonal arc aimed at his shoulder. Reynolds reacted. His right arm, still partially restrained, jerked upward, catching the baton-wielding guard's wrist and twisting it at an unnatural angle. A sickening crack followed. The alien shrieked, his weapon clattering to the floor. Before the second guard could react, Reynolds drove his elbow into his throat. Not enough to kill, just enough to silence. The room erupted into chaos. Cor was the first to move, stepping between Reynolds and Varlix, weapon raised. Stand down. Reynolds met his gaze, measuring. Cor held his stance, but he wasn't like the others. He wasn't panicking. He was calculating. Respect. Varlix, however, was seething. Restrain him. More guards flooded in, weapons drawn. Reynolds flexed his fingers, testing his restraints. Not yet. He let them force him back into the chair. Let them think they had won. As they secured the locks, Cor stepped closer. He studied Reynolds, then the broken guard writhing on the floor. That was controlled. Reynolds smirked. Could have been worse. Cor believed him. Varlix turned to Zeltor. Prepare for transport. We're done here. Reynolds tilted his head. Where are we going? Varlix's lips curled in satisfaction. A penal colony. No restraints, no interrogation. Just time. And time breaks everyone. Reynolds leaned back, unfazed. You sure? Varlix sneered. You are alone, human. Reynolds smiled. Not wide. Just enough. That's the thing, Commander. His voice was quiet, dangerous. I work better alone. The transport vessel cut through the void, its reinforced hull glinting against the distant starlight. Inside, the air was thick with quiet tension, the kind that settled in the bones before a storm. Jack Reynolds sat against the cold metal of his containment cell, wrists bound in high-tensile restraints, ankles locked to the floor. A single guard stood at the entrance, his weapon resting lazily at his side, as if the human was already a forgotten problem. Reynolds breathed evenly, his eyes half-lidded, his posture deceptively slack. He had studied every detail of this ship from the moment he was dragged aboard. Vent placement, security rotations, guard numbers. Every breath he took was a calculation. Every second, a step closer to opportunity. The door to the brig hissed open, and Lieutenant Cor stepped through. He was alone, his reptilian features unreadable in the dim light. He approached slowly, his boots making no sound against the floor. You should have broken, Cor murmured, stopping just outside the containment field. Reynolds exhaled through his nose. Disappointed, Cor tilted his head. No. Curious. His sharp gaze flickered to the damaged restraints around Reynolds's wrists, the barely perceptible shifts in his posture. You're waiting for something. Reynolds met his gaze, but said nothing. Cor stepped closer, lowering his voice. The penal colony is a death sentence. You understand that, don't you? A small, knowing smile tugged at Reynolds's lips. For who? Before Cor could reply, the ship rocked violently. Alarms flared to life, red lights spilling through the corridors. The intercom crackled with static, then a frantic voice. Command, we've lost primary thrusters. Some kind of... A burst of interference cut the message short. Reynolds straightened, right on time. The guard at the door stiffened, his weapon raising instinctively. Cor turned sharply, eyes narrowing. What did you do? Reynolds flexed his fingers. feeling the final strands of his restraints begin to weaken. "You should have checked my boots." Core's expression darkened. The guards had stripped the human of his weapons, his armor, but they hadn't considered the reinforced stitching along his combat boots, threaded with microfilaments of conductive wire, primed to overload electrical circuits. He had spent the past hours subtly scraping them against his bindings, redirecting just enough energy to short the fail-safe locks. The ship jolted again, harder this time. The artificial gravity stuttered for half a second, just long enough. Reynolds moved. His arms snapped free, muscles surging with controlled force. In one fluid motion, he wrenched forward, using the momentum to snap his legs from their restraints. Before the guard could fire, Reynolds grabbed his wrist, twisting the weapon free and sending the alien sprawling with a single, bone-snapping strike to the throat. Core was already moving, drawing his sidearm. Reynolds turned the stolen rifle toward him, but Core hesitated. Just for a fraction of a second, Reynolds took the risk and didn't pull the trigger. Core's grip tightened on his weapon, then slowly loosened. A choice had been made. Reynolds nodded once. Smart. He stepped past Core, rifle at the ready, moving with practiced efficiency. The ship was in chaos, crew scrambling to regain control. He needed the bridge, needed to ensure they wouldn't recover before he was gone. Core followed, his weapon still in hand but lowered. "Where do you think you're going?" Reynolds smirked. "Away." They moved through the corridors like shadows, slipping past disoriented crew members. Every step Reynolds took was deliberate, every glance calculated. He could feel the pulse of the ship, the subtle shift of its failing systems. They reached an intersection. Voices echoed from the right, armed security converging. Reynolds grabbed Core's shoulder and pulled him left. No words, just instinct. Core didn't resist. The bridge was close. One final stretch of open ground. A dozen feet of exposed space between them and the access door. Reynolds inhaled. "Cover me." Core hesitated for only a moment, then raised his weapon. Reynolds moved. A burst of energy fire lit up the corridor. He ducked low, rolling into cover as Core returned fire with practiced precision. Reynolds surged forward, reaching the control panel, fingers flying over the interface. Locked. Expected. He reached into his vest pocket, pulling free a sliver of metallic scrap. The guard's stolen security pass. A flicker of movement reflected in the screen. A soldier raising a rifle behind him. A single shot rang out. The soldier dropped. Reynolds glanced back. Core stood with his weapon still raised, eyes unreadable. The door to the bridge slid open. Inside, the command crew barely had time to react before Reynolds was on them. A single strike disabled the nearest officer. Another pivot sent a second sprawling. Core entered behind him, securing the room in 3 precise shots. Reynolds moved to the helm, scanning the controls. The ship was already spiraling toward an emergency landing trajectory, drawn toward the gravity well of a distant planet. Perfect. He turned to Core. "Last chance. You coming?" Core stared at him for a long moment, then holstered his weapon. "I'll take my own way down." Reynolds smirked. "Didn't think you'd make it easy." With a final glance at the failing controls, he moved toward the emergency escape pods. The ship was lost, its fate sealed. But his had just begun. The dense jungle loomed, an unbroken expanse of twisted roots and towering foliage, each shadow stretching long beneath the pale glow of an unfamiliar moon. Jack Reynolds crouched low, the thick, humid air clinging to his skin, each breath measured, controlled. The crash had been violent but expected. He had angled the pod's descent, steering it toward this uncharted terrain rather than open ground. Better to disappear into the wilderness than be an easy target in the wreckage. The first hour had been reconnaissance, mapping terrain, noting vantage points, marking potential hazards. The second hour had been about preparation. The crash site was no longer safe. They would come for him soon. They already were. A faint rustle in the undergrowth. Subtle, deliberate. Reynolds remained still, fingers tightening around the scavenged pulse pistol. Standard issue, low energy, unreliable at long range. He set it down. Not useful for this. His real weapon was patience. A figure emerged through the mist, tall, armored, moving with the calculated precision of a tracker. Not a scout, a hunter. Reynolds stayed low, watching, studying. The alien moved with confidence, scanning the environment, checking angles. Experience, but experience bred patterns. Predictability. The hunter's eyes flicked to the right, following a false trail Reynolds had left minutes ago. A momentary distraction, but enough. Reynolds struck. Silent, efficient, a single movement. Fast and practiced, his arm wrapping around the hunter's throat, cutting off sound before an alarm could be raised. A sharp twist, a short struggle, then stillness. The body slumped to the ground. He exhaled slowly, scanning the corpse. Light armor. No insignia. Not military, then mercenary. Hired hands, which meant more were coming. He retrieved the alien's rifle, checking its charge. Full. Good. He adjusted the settings, lowering the energy output for controlled bursts. No need to waste shots. A faint chirp echoed from the mercenary's wrist. A communicator. Reynolds grabbed it, listening. Unit 3 report. A pause. Then another voice. Unit 3 is down. So they had multiple teams. Standard search pattern, likely circling his last known position, which meant he had minutes before they closed in. Fine. Let them. He moved deeper into the trees, each step deliberate, each shift in movement designed to funnel his pursuers where he wanted them. A clearing lay ahead, a natural choke point bordered by thick rock formations, limited escape routes, a death trap if entered wrong, a perfect kill zone if entered right. He took position in the shadows, rifle raised, breathing steady. Then they came, 3 figures, sweeping the area with practiced precision. No wasted movement. They weren't underestimating him anymore. Good. That made it interesting. The first moved into range. Reynolds squeezed the trigger. A single, controlled shot. The alien dropped before the others could react. The second turned, weapon raised, but Reynolds had already repositioned, using the terrain as cover. A burst of energy fire scorched past where he had been moments ago. Sloppy, rushed. He capitalized on it, shifting to a new vantage point, angling downward. Another shot. The second target fell. The third was smarter. He dove for cover, rolling behind a boulder, weapon primed, scanning for movement. Reynolds didn't give him any. Instead, he let the silence work for him, let the tension build. The mind was an enemy as much as any weapon. A minute passed, then another. The third mercenary shifted, uncertain now. Reynolds struck from behind, a knife to the throat. The jungle was silent again. He wiped the blade clean, stepping over the bodies, taking what supplies he could. They had underestimated him once. Now, they were adapting, which meant the real hunt was about to begin. The ridge provided the perfect vantage point. Jack Reynolds lay prone, his breathing slow and controlled, the alien rifle steady against his shoulder. The jungle stretched below him, dense and tangled, but the clearing at its center was bare, unnatural. A controlled burn had cleared the undergrowth, leaving only scorched earth and jagged remnants of trees. At its center, a temporary command post had been erected, a beacon of arrogance. They thought they had him cornered. Reynolds adjusted the rifle scope, the targeting reticle sweeping across the encampment. Dozens of mercenaries moved with precision, their patrols tight, their positions layered. But tight formations had weaknesses. Patterns could be exploited. His crosshairs settled on a figure near the center. High Commander Varlix. Reynolds exhaled, aligning the shot. The moment stretched, time slowing to a pinpoint of clarity. Wind speed, distance, breathing. A single pull of the trigger. The shot rang out, silent and deadly. The energy bolt tore through the night, striking Varlix's personal shield with a crackling burst. The commander stumbled but did not fall. His armor had held, just barely. The camp erupted into chaos. Reynolds was already moving. He rolled back from the ridge, disappearing into the underbrush, knowing exactly what would happen next. A retaliation, a full-force sweep. They would assume he had stayed in position. That was their first mistake. The second was thinking they could catch him. He circled wide, moving like a ghost through the jungle, his pace never hurried but never hesitant. The mercenaries fanned out, sweeping the ridge with suppressive fire, their formation breaking just enough. Reynolds took his next shot from their flank. One down, then another. Controlled, precise, never revealing his position for more than a second. The jungle became his battlefield, the darkness his ally. Panic crept into their ranks. He could hear it in the way their commands became sharper, in the frantic shift of their movements. They had come as hunters, but now they were prey. Reynolds found his next perch, settling behind the thick trunk of a fallen tree. He could see Varlix again, barking orders, his shield flickering from the earlier damage. The commander was adjusting, adapting, but he was still thinking like a soldier. Reynolds was thinking like a sniper. He took the shot. The shield failed. Varlix staggered, his leg buckling, the energy blast carving deep. He fell to one knee, gripping the wound. For a long moment, the battlefield stilled. Reynolds could finish it. One last shot. Clean. Final. But he didn't. Instead, he activated the stolen communicator, his voice calm. Called him off. Silence crackled over the channel. Then, Varlix's ragged breath. You think you've won? Reynolds smirked. I know I have. Varlix's forces were broken, scattered, morale shattered. The hunt was over. Reynolds faded into the jungle, leaving only a lesson behind. Never hunt a sniper.